a darker time. Hey there! Tonight we're stepping into a world painted in shadows. A world of plagues, punishment, and struggle. Picture this. A time where life was brutal, fleeting, and often unforgiving. Forget what Hollywood's glossy films have told you about grand castles and noble knights. The truth? You probably wouldn't last a single day. The Middle Ages were not a time of chivalry and gallantry. They were about survival. Before we dive in, take a moment to give a thumbs up if you're ready to walk through this story, and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with what you're about to hear. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. There's something special in knowing that, across the globe, we're all here experiencing this together. Now, dim the lights, maybe set a fan on low for that calming background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey back in time. A day in the life 1325. Congratulations! You've just woken up in the year 1325. The good news? You're alive. The bad news? So are the fleas. You groggily open your eyes to find yourself resting on a half-rotten straw mattress. It's more a bed of hay than a place for rest. Filled with insects, dust, and a smell of decay that lingers in the air like the stench of the barn floor it once was. The hay might have been fresh 3 months ago, but now is a breeding ground for pests. You stretch and immediately regret it. The chill air cuts through your skin, and your joints, which ache like old timber, protest with every movement. You're 22, which, by medieval standards, is practically middle-aged. Your spine creaks like an old door, and your knees crack like stones being crushed beneath heavy boots. There's no comfort here, only the sharp, biting cold of the morning and the rough texture of a wool blanket that hasn't been washed since last winter. It's heavier now, not from warmth, but from the filth that's been absorbed over months of use. As the distant toll of the church bell rings through the air, you grimace. It's the medieval alarm clock, a jarring sound, far more unforgiving than any modern buzzer. Your home, if you can call it that, is a small wooden hut with one room. There are no windows, only smoke-stained walls and a floor so uneven it could double as an obstacle course. The air smells of a mixture of stale beer, the pungent scent of sweat, and the unmistakable odor of livestock. And yes, that smell you hope isn't mold? It's probably mold. Getting out of bed is a gamble. The floor is either wet from the rain that leaked through the thatched roof last night, or it's crusted with something that, given the choice, you'd rather not inspect. Either way, your bare feet sink into a mixture of earth and whatever else is crawling there. Privacy, that's a joke. Everyone you know, from your family to an odd cousin who just never left, is crammed into this single space, and none of them have the decency to give you a moment of solitude. So, you stand, together in discomfort with a family and their livestock, all sharing the same space, the same germs, and the same space to breathe. The reality of the morning routine. Now that you're standing, nature has a call, and it's not a polite one. You wish for a toilet, a seat, a modicum of privacy. But alas, the 14th century has none of these comforts. For the common folk, your bathroom is often a wooden bucket behind the house. And if that's full, then you're left to find another. The smell? Biblical. It's a quick task. Hold your breath, do your business, and then here's the best part. Toss it into the street. And yes, that's right, into the street. You shout "Garde à l'eau," an old French warning to alert people below. Except no one's moving fast enough, and so the streets in medieval towns are basically open sewers. You think it's bad now, but here's the kicker. In some places, this is still seen as an improvement. If you're lucky, there's a public latrine in town. Think of it like an outhouse, except no privacy and a smell you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy. Privacy? Forget it. Instead, you're sitting shoulder to shoulder with strangers, sharing the most intimate of moments. And no, toilet paper wasn't a thing. Most people resort to using rags, leaves, or whatever else they can find. You don't shake hands often, and if you do, you might just want to take a step back first. The morning hunger, a grim reality. Now that the morning duties are done, it's time for something that we can hope might bring comfort. Breakfast. Unfortunately, it doesn't. You won't be sitting down to eggs, bacon, or a fresh cup of coffee. Instead, you face the grim reality of medieval sustenance. Pottage.
Immagine adic.
Glooping stew made from whatever's available, grains, root vegetables, maybe a few beans if you're lucky. It's been simmering for days, sometimes even weeks. Fresh ingredients, they're a luxury few can afford. New food gets dumped on top of the old leftovers, forming a never-ending cycle of mystery stew. No recipes here, just survival. On the side, you might have a hunk of bread, but don't get too excited. This isn't the soft, fluffy loaf you're familiar with. This bread is as hard as a stone, so tough you might risk breaking a tooth trying to bite into it. It's made from coarse rye or barley flour, bulked up with whatever's available: sawdust, acorns, and anything else that can stretch a meager supply. Wheat, that's a rich man's dream. What about a drink? Don't expect any morning coffee or juice. Instead, you start your day with weak ale. It's not for pleasure, it's for survival. The water, it's unsafe, filled with parasites and filth. So instead you drink beer, low in alcohol but high in survival value. Even children drink it. It's not a choice, it's necessity. If you're dreaming of a luxurious meal, meat, cheese, fruit, well, forget it. That's for the rich and only on special occasions. Meat is a rare treat for most peasants, and fresh fruit only when it's in season, and even then it might already be fermented into wine. The food is barely enough to fill your stomach, let alone sustain you for the day ahead. But it's what you've got, so you eat it, gritting your teeth against the taste, knowing that this meager portion is likely the best you'll get for the next few days. The daily grind, work begins. After the grim breakfast, it's time to work, because in the Middle Ages, there's no such thing as a weekend. No time off.
No breaks.
You don't get to clock out and head home. Your job? To work the land for someone else's comfort. Your Lord's comfort, to be specific. Your tools are primitive. Maybe a hoe, perhaps a rusty sickle, and your body is already protesting the wear and tear of endless toil. There's no clock watching. There's only the sun, and when it sets, that's when your day ends. If you're a woman, your job doesn't stop there. You also take care of children, tend to the house, cook, clean, and manage the livestock, all while your husband's lice slowly make their way to your side of the bed. Oh, and don't expect help. His idea of work is likely to sit around while you carry the weight of everything else. And if you're a child, your job starts young. Around the age of 5, you're handed a small rake, a tiny shovel, or whatever tool you can manage, and you begin to work alongside your parents. There's no school, no toys, just survival. And if you're one of the lucky few who doesn't work the fields, maybe you're a blacksmith, a tanner, or a cooper, still, your day is filled with the same backbreaking work. You sweat, you bleed, you burn yourself, and you keep going. Because if you stop, you don't eat. Simple as that. The weather, the never-ending battle. After hours of labor, it's time to think about the weather. The temperature is less about seasons and more about whether or not the sky is going to punish you. Let's start with winter. No central heating, no insulation, just wooden walls with gaps wide enough for a chicken to squeeze through. Your windows are covered with cloth, but that's not doing much to keep the cold out. The fire in the hearth is nice, but you don't have enough firewood to keep it going long enough to actually warm your home. And gathering wood is risky because in medieval Europe, it was illegal to pick up the wrong stick from the wrong forest. That's right, you could get executed for that. So, you huddle in your damp wool tunic, trying to keep warm next to the meager embers of your fire, but the cold seeps into your bones. The air is biting, and your fingers stiffen, feeling like tiny medieval popsicles. Frostbite? That's just called bad luck. Your feet are perpetually damp, your joints are frozen, and you wonder how long it's going to take before the winter actually kills you. And then summer arrives, and with it, heat. The heat turns your home into an oven. There's no fan, no cross breeze, no relief. You sweat through your layers of clothing, but you can't take them off because showing too much skin is considered scandalous. The flies are out in full force, buzzing around your unwashed body, and the smell of last week's goat stew that's still fermenting in the corner fills the air. And if you're working in the fields, the sun bakes you until you're dizzy. There's no sunscreen, no hat to shield your head from the harsh rays. Just the relentless sun and the constant sweat pouring from your body. No matter the season, one thing remains the same. Your clothes itch, your food tastes terrible, and there's no escape from the constant struggle of survival. The weather is never your friend. It's a cruel reminder that, in the Middle Ages, your existence was constantly under siege. By the elements, by the hardships of life, and by death itself. Water, the silent killer. And if you're thirsty, too bad. Water, while essential, is also dangerous. The stream might look refreshing. Its water's clear and bubbling like something out of a fairy tale, but it's probably contaminated. Maybe someone upstream just dumped their chamber pot in it, or perhaps a dead animal is decomposing in the water. Either way, you're drinking parasites with every sip. And bathing? Well, forget that. Back then, people believed that bathing opened the pores and let disease in. That's right, water, the very thing we rely on for cleanliness, was considered a threat to your health. The concept of personal hygiene was as foreign as fresh air. Communal bathhouses existed, but they quickly gained a reputation as places for gossip, scandal, and sometimes more than just bathing. If you were lucky enough to bathe, you had to fetch water from the well, boil it over a fire, and pray the rest of the family didn't beat you to it. Water, like everything else in the medieval world, was a gamble. A source of life, yes, but also a deadly game of chance. Medicine, a test of survival. Now that you've endured the grind of the day, it's time to face another challenge, your health. What happens when something goes wrong? when your body finally betrays you after a lifetime of labor. Well, in the Middle Ages, medicine was a joke, a cruel, often painful joke. If you had a fever, a cough, or a wound, the first thing you'd hear is that your humors, those four mysterious bodily fluids, are out of balance. You might have heard of them: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to medieval science, keeping them balanced was key to good health. Too much blood? Time for a good old bloodletting. Nothing says cure like draining half your life force, right? Barbers doubled as doctors, so when you went to get your hair trimmed, you might also leave with a few less pints of blood in your body. Got a headache? A toothache? You might get the same treatment. For toothaches, there were no dentists. Instead, you would go to the local barber surgeon, who would pull your tooth out with a rusty pair of pliers and a prayer. It sounds gruesome, but that's how it was. And heaven help you if that infection spreads. With no antibiotics, an infected tooth could mean sepsis and a slow, painful death. If you broke a bone, your chances of surviving the pain were slim. There were no painkillers, no anesthesia, no way to numb the agony. Surgery was done with knives that hadn't been properly cleaned since the Crusades. There were no antiseptics, just a fire-heated blade, ready to cut you open. And if you were lucky, you'd pass out from the pain before they even finished. It was a time of trial and error, and often the error came with a high price, your life. The never-ending struggle, food and survival. So now, let's talk about dinner. At the end of another long, brutal day, your stomach growls in hunger. Surely dinner will be better than breakfast, right? Sorry. The truth is, food in the Middle Ages wasn't about comfort. It was about survival. Food preservation, non-existent. There's no fridge, no freezer, just salt, smoke, and whatever method you can find to keep food from spoiling. Meat, if you're lucky enough to have it, has been hanging for days, covered in flies and possibly shared with rats. Your bread, that same tough, stale loaf from breakfast. Sometimes, desperate times call for desperate measures, and bread might be stretched with bark or even clay to make it last. And let's not forget the fungus that sometimes grows on rye, ergot, a potent poison that can cause hallucinations, seizures, and even death. If you're lucky enough to find some vegetables, it's probably turnips. The amount of turnips in the medieval diet is almost legendary. Boiled, mashed, or floating in your mystery stew of pottage, turnips were a staple. As for fruit, only in season, and even then, it's often fermenting into wine before you can get your hands on it. Want something to drink? Don't expect fresh water. You'll be drinking beer. Not the craft brews you might dream of, but weak ale, low alcohol, designed more for survival than for pleasure. The water is so contaminated that drinking it would be a death sentence. At least beer will protect your stomach from the parasites swimming in the water. Wine, if you can afford it, is for the wealthy. For you, beer is your daily beverage of choice. Clothing, the burden you wear. After a long day of hard labor, it's time to change into something more comfortable. But, of course, there's no such thing as comfort. Your wardrobe consists of exactly one outfit, maybe two if you're lucky. A rough wool tunic or a linen shift is the best you'll get. There's no seasonal wardrobe. You wear this outfit every day, sometimes for years. There's no laundry service, no washing machine, no soap. Your clothes are stiff, grimy, and they smell like a compost pile that's been left in a pigsty. Your shoes? If you have them, they're likely made of untreated leather, barely stitched together, offering as much support as walking on broken glass. Most peasants, however, just go barefoot, stepping through mud, dung, and whatever else the streets have to offer. The worst part? The constant itching. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs make their home on your body. They live rent-free, leaving you scratching yourself throughout the day. And forget about a visit to the dermatologist. If you get a rash, you deal with it. You can only hope it doesn't get infected, because there's nothing you can do about it. The toothless smile, an oral health crisis. After all that suffering, you might think it's time to flash a smile. But in the Middle Ages, smiling was a dangerous game, not emotionally but dentally. There's no toothbrush, no toothpaste, no floss. Oral hygiene didn't exist. If you were lucky, you might rinse your mouth with vinegar or wine, but that's about as far as it goes. By the time you hit your mid-20s, your teeth are decayed, your gums are swollen, and you're left with a mouth that's more rotten than anything else. Cavities are rampant, and those aren't just food stains on your teeth. They're the result of years of bad hygiene and poor diet. If you were a noble, you had the privilege of rotting your teeth faster than the peasants, thanks to sugar, which was becoming more common in the upper classes. But for the rest of the population, you're stuck with years of decay and toothaches that are a constant part of your life. Tooth pain is a background hum, always there, reminding you of your inevitable decline. If you're unlucky enough to get a severe tooth infection, your only option is to see the local barber surgeon. They'll pull the tooth out without anesthesia, and if you're lucky, they won't kill you in the process. The violence of the medieval world. Now that we've covered the physical hardships of your day, it's time to talk about the most brutal part of medieval life, violence. And I'm not just talking about the kind of violence you might see on the battlefield or in the streets. I'm talking about the kind of violence that is woven into the very fabric of everyday life. Life in medieval Europe was violent. The idea of law and order, it didn't exist the way we think of it today. If someone stole a loaf of bread, they might lose a hand. If you gossiped too much, you might end up in a scold's bridle. A metal mask strapped to your face with a bar in your mouth to prevent you from speaking. But that's just the beginning. Let's talk about punishment. If you were accused of something serious, say heresy or witchcraft, the way to prove your innocence wasn't with a lawyer or a fair trial. It was with torture. Welcome to trial by ordeal. One version of this involved plunging your hand into boiling water to retrieve a stone. If you were innocent, your hand would heal without infection in 3 days. If you were guilty, well, the infection would be a sign of your guilt. Another version, you were thrown into a river. If you sank, you were innocent, though you'd probably drown. If you floated, you were guilty, and they'd punish you anyway. And executions? Those weren't private affairs. They were public events, often attended by cheering crowds. Public beheadings, hangings, and burnings were the entertainment of the day. Sometimes people even brought snacks. Domestic violence? That was the norm. Husbands were expected to discipline their wives and children, sometimes brutally. And street fights? You could be beaten just for looking at someone's noble horse the wrong way. This wasn't a society trying to bring justice. This was a society where violence was simply part of the rhythm of life. Every day you lived knowing that the next punch, the next blow, could be the one that ended your life. It wasn't about who you were. It was about how much power someone else had over you, and whether they decided that your existence was worth living. The uncertainty of life and early death. After enduring the constant violence and hardship of medieval life, you might hope for a long life. But the truth is, if you're alive past the age of 40, you're practically a celebrity. The average life expectancy, around 30 to 40 years. And that number is skewed by the high rate of infant mortality. Half of all children died before they reached the age of 5. If you survived your childhood, congratulations, you made it to a life of suffering. Men's deaths often came from accidents, infections from minor wounds, or conflicts with their neighbors. Some died in crusades, others in drunken brawls. Even simple tasks like walking to the market could result in an untimely end if you encountered a bandit or an angry tax collector. Women, though, faced a different set of dangers, mostly centered around childbirth. There was no prenatal care, no sterile tools, no anesthesia. Giving birth was a gamble, one that could end with the death of the mother, the child, or both. Some women survived 10 pregnancies. Others didn't survive even 2. Even if you did make it to your 30s or 40s, your body would have been worn down from years of backbreaking labor, malnutrition, and the constant threat of disease. By the time you hit your 30s, your body would have aged as though you were already in your 50s. Your joints would creak, your bones would ache, and the constant work would leave your spirit feeling just as tired as your body. The afterlife, a harsh farewell. And when death comes, it doesn't come with a gentle passing. No peaceful bed to rest in, no family around to mourn you. Medieval funerals were quick affairs, usually hastily conducted to avoid the spread of disease. Bodies were often buried without ceremony, if they were buried at all. The idea of embalming? Not a chance. You were lucky if you were buried at all. Most people were simply tossed into a mass grave and covered with a thin layer of earth. There were no polished coffins, no ornate graves, just a shallow mound of dirt and a few murmured prayers. For those who died from the plague or from famine, funerals were even more brutal. If you died from the plague, your family might not even get a chance to bury you. Your body would be thrown into a pit with hundreds of others, covered in quicklime to prevent the spread of disease. That was your final resting place, among the bodies of the thousands who had succumbed to the same fate. If you were lucky, though, you might get a proper burial. But that doesn't mean you'd be remembered. In the medieval world, only the rich and powerful got the luxury of having their memory preserved. For the rest of you, your death would be little more than an afterthought. The end of the day, a long, hard life. After all that, you might hope the end of the day brings some respite. But there is no peace in the Middle Ages, not really. After a day of grueling labor, uncertainty, and violence, your evening will be much like the morning. Cold, uncomfortable, and unrelenting. You'll crawl into bed, if you can call it that, with no privacy, no comfort, and no assurance that tomorrow will be any better. The medieval world wasn't about luxury. It was about survival. Every single day was a struggle, and you never knew when that struggle might end. But here's the wild thing. Despite all of this, people still found ways to live. They laughed, they sang, they loved. They found meaning in the darkest of times. They persevered. So, as you lie down tonight in your warm bed, with a roof over your head, clean sheets, and the certainty of modern medicine, take a moment to appreciate what you have, because your ancestors fought, survived, and endured all of this, just so you wouldn't have to. The system of belief, religion as law. Now, let's take a step back and consider the role of religion in your life. In the Middle Ages, faith wasn't just a part of life. It was life itself. The church controlled everything, your calendar, your laws, your birth, your marriage, even your death. It was the spiritual landlord that you could never escape, and you were always behind on rent. Each day was dictated by the sound of the church bells. Morning, noon, and night, they rang loud, demanding, impossible to ignore. Missing a prayer wasn't just a minor slip-up. It was a sin, and a serious one at that. Forget to bow your head during Mass?
Sin.
Eat meat on a Friday? Double sin. Have a sinful thought about your neighbor's wife? Well, that's not just sinning. That's opening yourself up to eternal damnation. The church had a monopoly on interpretation. You couldn't read the Bible because it was written in Latin, and only the priests and select nobles knew Latin. So you relied on the clergy to tell you what God was thinking. If your crops failed, it wasn't because of bad weather or poor farming. It was because you didn't pray hard enough. If you got sick, it was because you had a sinful soul. Your salvation was tied to your devotion, but no matter how devout you were, you could never be certain of your place in heaven. The church demanded tithes, a tenth of everything you had. If you grew wheat, you gave a tenth of that. If you had chickens, you gave eggs. If you had nothing, you were spiritually bankrupt and financially doomed. There were plenty of holy days, but they weren't for rest or joy. They were for more prayer, fasting, and reminders of your unworthiness. And don't even think about questioning the church. If you did, you were labeled a heretic, and the punishment for heresy was brutal: burning at the stake, drowning, or worse. The fear of eternal damnation loomed over everything. It wasn't just a matter of punishment in the afterlife. It was a matter of survival. If the local priest didn't like you, or if you fell out of favor with the church, you could find yourself ostracized, your soul condemned, and your life ruined. The role of women: endurance and obedience. If you think this sounds difficult, try living it as a woman. Because for all the suffering men faced, women's lives in the Middle Ages were even harder. Women didn't just deal with the harshness of medieval life. They were expected to endure it silently, with grace. From the moment a girl was born, her life path was already mapped out for her. Marry young, bear children, serve your husband, and die tired. Simple as that. Girls didn't go to school. If you were from a noble family, you might get some education, but for the majority, your intellectual development stopped once you learned how to churn butter and patch a tunic. There was no space for ambition. Your job was to raise children, manage the household, and cater to your husband's every need. Marriage wasn't about love. It was about alliances, land, and power. You could be betrothed at 12 and married by 14. Your opinion on the matter hardly considered. Once married, a woman's role was to be obedient. If you didn't obey, you risked being branded a nag or, worse, a witch. And being accused of witchcraft was a death sentence. Women weren't just accused of witchcraft for practicing the occult. They were accused for having too much knowledge, especially if that knowledge had to do with herbs, healing, or even just for being outspoken. The consequences of being labeled a witch were catastrophic. You could be burned alive, drowned, or imprisoned. But what about motherhood? That was your ultimate fate. Childbirth was a lottery, one that many women lost. Without proper medical care, without anesthesia, without sterile conditions, childbirth was a dangerous, often deadly gamble. Even the most minor complication could lead to death for both mother and child. Some women survived 10 pregnancies. Others didn't survive 2. And if you were a widow, well, then you were vulnerable. Vulnerable to violence, to poverty, to being judged as a woman with no value. But a married woman, even with all the hardships, was still the property of her husband. You were expected to produce heirs, to keep your house running, and to never complain about your own suffering. If you did, the label of witch was waiting for you, along with a gruesome punishment. The idea of a woman being anything other than a servant to men, whether as a wife, mother, or widow, was unthinkable. Women were confined to a life of endurance. Endure your pain, endure your grief, and never show weakness, because any weakness could be your undoing. The harsh reality of death, a public affair. As we venture further into the harsh realities of medieval life, there's one final truth to confront: death. And death in the Middle Ages wasn't the quiet, peaceful affair we imagine today. It was loud, public, and in many ways terrifying. You didn't just die and fade away. You were watched. People saw your suffering, and in some cases they were part of it. Public executions were the highlight of the day. Hangings, beheadings, burnings, these were spectacles, the medieval equivalent of modern-day reality TV. The crowd gathered, cheered, and even brought snacks. Your death was a form of entertainment for the masses, and it wasn't just criminals who were punished in this way. Heretics, witches, thieves, all were given the same brutal treatment. If you were unlucky enough to be accused of a crime, you could be executed in the town square with the entire population looking on. And for the guilty, well, your punishment was meant to serve as an example. Crime wasn't just punished, it was publicly broadcasted. It was a show of power, showing the peasantry who was in charge and reminding them that any disobedience, no matter how small, could result in a grisly fate. If you thought you could escape, think again. Every aspect of life in the Middle Ages was designed to control you, your body, your soul, and your death. Every day was a negotiation with survival, and for many, death was the only release from an unyielding existence. Final thoughts. A life of suffering and survival. And so, after a long, hard day of work, violence, discomfort, and survival, you finally rest your weary body. But even in death, there's no real peace. You are buried quickly, often in an unmarked grave, or tossed into a mass pit if the plague has taken you. There are no gravestones, no memorials. The idea of your life being remembered is fleeting. Only the powerful, the rich, or the kings and queens have monuments erected in their honor. For the rest, you fade into obscurity, your name forgotten, your life reduced to a footnote in the history of a brutal world. But perhaps that is where the true legacy lies, in the struggle, in the survival, The people who lived these brutal, difficult lives are the ones who made the modern world possible. They fought against the cruelty of their existence, and though we may not know their names, their stories still echo in the streets, in the fields, and in the art they left behind. They endured, and in that endurance they left a legacy. The legacy of survival, of defiance, and of life in the face of death. Endurance through the elements, living with nature's wrath. When you wake up the next morning, the weather hasn't changed, and neither has your fate. If anything, it's even worse. The seasons of medieval life weren't defined by the gentle rhythm we experience today, but by constant extremes. Winter and summer didn't bring comfort. They brought suffering. Winter in the Middle Ages was a relentless battle against the cold. You might have a fire, but it would be small and weak as firewood was expensive, and gathering it could sometimes get you executed for trespassing in the forest. Your house is a wooden structure, with gaps in the walls you could easily throw a chicken through.
No anselaschen. No central heating.
You bundle up in your wool tunic, your damp feet cold and numb, and yet you still wake up frozen, praying for a warm day that will never come. Your fingers stiffen like icicles, your body constantly chilled to the bone. And when summer comes, it's not the relief you might hope for. Without proper ventilation, your home becomes an oven. You sweat through your layers, but heaven forbid you try to take them off. Modesty was essential, and exposing too much skin wasn't just scandalous. It could ruin your reputation. The heat becomes unbearable. There are no cooling devices, no fans, just the suffocating warmth of your walls closing in on you. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and spoiled food. Mosquitoes buzz around you while flies dance on your food. The very air seems to oppress you, and you're left to sweat through it, your body working as hard as your mind to endure. It wasn't just discomfort, it was torture. Whether you were shivering through winter or sweating through summer, your body was at the mercy of the elements. There was no reprieve, no sanctuary from the forces that controlled your life. The unseen threats, disease, pestilence, and the invisible enemy. Then, there's the ever-present threat of disease. You could be strong, healthy, and full of life one day, and the next, stricken with fever, vomiting, and weakness. The plague, smallpox, and even more mundane diseases like dysentery were all too common. Hygiene? Forget it. Bathing was seen as dangerous, a belief rooted in superstition rather than science. The idea that water could open your pores and let the disease in made most people avoid it altogether. You might wash your hands with wine or rinse your mouth with vinegar, but that's the extent of your cleanliness. If you get sick, the first thing you hear is that your humors are out of balance again. If you're lucky, they might send for the barber surgeon, who will perform bloodletting to rebalance you. But more often than not, you're on your own, left to suffer until your body either gives in to the disease or manages to fight it off. There are no doctors to turn to, no antibiotics to cure infections, no vaccine to protect you from the horrors lurking in the air. Diseases like the plague could wipe out entire villages in the blink of an eye, spreading through the streets like wildfire. The fear of disease, the knowledge that your life could be snuffed out at any moment, was a constant undercurrent in medieval life. And when the plague arrived, it didn't knock. It took entire families, entire communities with frightening speed. You could be standing next to your friend one day and the next, they're gone, buried in a mass grave with hundreds of others. The world around you is an enemy you cannot fight. A constant battle against things you can't see, can't control. The rats that spread disease, the mosquitoes that carry parasites, the air thick with germs, all of it a silent, invisible threat to your survival. The harsh reality of work, a lifetime of labor. So, after surviving the night and battling the elements, it's time to head out to work again. But there is no work-life balance in the medieval world. There is only work, endless, back-breaking labor that never ends. If you're lucky enough to be a farmer, your day starts at sunrise and ends at sunset. You don't get weekends off, and the thought of taking a sick day is a joke. You work 6 days a week, sometimes more, without rest, without reprieve. You might spend your day plowing fields, sowing seeds, pulling weeds, or carrying water from the nearest river. And when the seasons change, the work changes with it. Harvesting crops, gathering firewood, feeding animals. It's all on you. You don't get to call in sick. You don't get to rest. You do the work, or you starve. Women, of course, have it worse. You don't just work in the fields, you also manage the home. You cook, you clean, you raise children, you spin wool, and you care for the animals. You do all of this while still maintaining the household's dignity. If you're a woman, you don't just work. You are the backbone of your family, the silent force that keeps everything running. Your worth is tied to your productivity. If you can't work, you can't eat. Children work too. They start helping out as soon as they can hold a rake or shovel. By the age of 5, they're already learning the ropes of survival. There's no childhood here, just a steady march towards adulthood, towards responsibility. A child's dream is to survive to adulthood. And if you're one of the lucky few who aren't farmers, maybe you're a blacksmith, a tanner, or a carpenter. Great. But that means your work is just as grueling, if not more so. You're working with fire, with sharp tools, with chemicals, with animal hides. The pay is low and the risk is high. Get burned? Too bad. Break a bone? Deal with it. Get sick? Drink some beer and keep working. You can't afford to stop. If you stop, you don't eat. And the most horrifying part of all, the work never ends. There is no retirement. There is no time for rest or relaxation. Your life is a series of tasks, one after another, until you collapse from exhaustion, or the plague finally claims you. The real cost of survival, a brutal and unyielding existence. At the end of the day, as you collapse back into your straw-filled mattress, you realize one painful truth. There is no escape. You've lived this way your entire life. You've endured the cold, the heat, the labor, the disease, the violence. And tomorrow you'll do it all over again. The medieval world didn't offer luxury. It didn't offer safety. It didn't offer comfort. It only offered survival. You fought for your life every single day, and there were no guarantees. If you made it to the end of the week, the end of the month, the end of the year, well, congratulations. You were part of the lucky few. But even then, luck has little to do with it. If you were born poor, you stayed poor. If you were born with no power, you stayed powerless. There was no social mobility, no chance to improve your station in life. You worked until you could work no longer, and then you died. And through it all, there was no sympathy. No one cared if you were tired, sick, or hungry. No one cared if you had a bad day. You survived or you didn't. That was the only rule of life in medieval Europe. Facing the inevitability of death, a culture of mortality. As you wake once again to the harsh reality of medieval life, the weight of one more brutal truth presses upon you. Death. It's not a gentle whisper, nor is it a quiet part of the natural order. In the medieval world, death is everywhere, woven into the fabric of daily life like a shadow that never quite leaves you. Life expectancy? It hovers around 30 to 40 years, but this number is skewed. Half of all children die before their 5th birthday. And even if you manage to survive into adulthood, you're already a walking statistic. Your life is not guaranteed. One bad winter, one small wound left untreated, one chance encounter with a stranger carrying the plague could mean your end. Let's talk about your funeral, if you're lucky enough to have one. For the poor, death is a rushed affair. There's no embalming, no preserving your body for future generations to gaze upon. No beautifully crafted coffins, no monuments bearing your name. You are thrown into a shallow grave or tossed into a mass pit with others, covered by a thin layer of earth. The plague, famine, or simple neglect often prevents even the most basic ceremony. And yet, for the wealthy and powerful, death is treated as an art. Nobles and monarchs might get grand burials, surrounded by expensive treasures, intricate rituals, and displays of pomp and grandeur. But for the vast majority, you simply disappear. Your name is forgotten, your body a nameless relic beneath the earth. Even the rich, while remembered for their deeds, are rarely mourned in the way we might think of today. A king or queen's tomb might be visited for centuries, but they too are buried in a world that constantly shifts. Mortality doesn't discriminate. Whether you're a peasant or a monarch, you are simply another soul that must face the inevitable passage from life to death. As your life goes on, you understand that death doesn't wait for the perfect moment. It's not some distant fear. It's a reality that lingers. One misstep, one illness, one accident, and you're gone. The closer you get to death, the more you learn about how fragile life truly is. It doesn't wait for you to be ready. The question becomes not how long you will live, but how you will survive until the end. The constant threat of death is one of the most haunting aspects of medieval existence. It's not just physical death you're battling. It's the fear of being forgotten, of leaving no mark, no legacy. You fight for survival, but for what? So you can die in obscurity? So you can become just another forgotten body buried in a hastily dug pit? Revolution in the shadows. Secret resistance. But despite all of this, even in the bleakest moments, there are those who resist. They resist the violence, the hardship, and the relentless cycles of suffering. These rebels live in the shadows, moving quietly beneath the radar, ever watchful for the smallest opportunity to disrupt the cruel systems that dominate their world. This resistance isn't always obvious. It doesn't always look like a grand rebellion or a bloody battle in the streets. Sometimes it's the simple act of surviving against the odds. Sometimes it's in the smallest act of defiance, the refusal to bow before an unjust lord, the quiet resistance of working through your pain when your body wants to collapse, the decision to dream of a better life even when the reality seems impossible. In the midst of all this suffering, some find their voice. They might not overthrow the kings or break the system wide open, but their resistance lies in their ability to hold onto something greater than the brutality around them. Hope. Even in the darkest, there's a flicker of light, a flicker that refuses to be extinguished, and that flicker is powerful. Perhaps it's in the form of the woman who, despite the crushing expectations of medieval life, dares to speak out, to challenge her place. Perhaps it's in the child who, despite the endless back-breaking labor, still dreams of a different future. Maybe it's in the worker who knows that despite all the hardship, they are not entirely at the mercy of those above them. Even in a world where everything is designed to crush your spirit, there's a quiet rebellion that keeps people going. Conclusion. Resilience in the face of suffering. As you lie down for another night in your crowded, uncomfortable hovel, the weight of medieval life presses down on you again. But in the midst of it all, you can't help but admire the resilience of the human spirit. It's a spirit that refuses to bow easily, even when it seems that every part of the world is conspiring to break it. The people of the medieval era didn't have luxury, they didn't have comforts, and they certainly didn't have modern conveniences. What they had was sheer grit. They had the ability to endure, to fight, and to find meaning in a world that often seemed devoid of it. And perhaps that's the real story of medieval life. It's not the grand castles or the chivalric knights. It's the people who lived and survived in the shadows. It's the daily struggle against insurmountable odds. It's the resilience to keep going even when the world tells you to stop. Tonight, when you slip into your warm bed, surrounded by the comforts of modern life, take a moment to remember them. Remember the people who lived without electricity, without running water, and without the medical advances that we take for granted today. Remember the peasants, the workers, the mothers, and the fathers who lived and died in a world that didn't care about their survival. And remember the light they managed to keep burning in the darkest of times. They didn't have luxury, but they had something that was even more powerful. Their humanity. The struggle for power. Political games in medieval society. In a world where life is fragile, power becomes a lifeline. The medieval era wasn't just a period of hardship. It was also one of brutal political maneuvering. And for many, the quest for power was as vital as the quest for food or shelter. It was the key to survival, and the means by which you could rise above the constant oppression that defined your life. The game of politics in the medieval world was a deadly one. Here, power didn't come from skill or intellect alone. It came from your ability to navigate the perilous web of alliances, betrayals, and violence that wove the fabric of society. For the common man, politics was something you could only observe from the sidelines. Your fate was determined by those above you, by the lords and kings who sat at the top of the feudal system. But even if you were a peasant, a serf, or a lowly tradesman, you understood that power was the currency of the realm. It's what kept you in line, what kept you working, and what kept you surviving. If you were a noble, power was something you constantly fought to maintain. It wasn't a given. It wasn't secure. One wrong move, one weak decision, and your position could be stripped away. And, as you might imagine, there were no gentle removals in the medieval world. Lose your title, and you lost everything, your lands, your wealth, and often your life. For a king, power meant the entire world. It meant control over vast territories, over armies, over lives. It meant the ability to shape history, to make decisions that would impact generations. But it also meant constant danger. Political scheming was a daily part of royal life. Even the most powerful kings had to watch their backs, for there were always those who coveted the throne. Rebellion was never far off. One misstep, and you might find yourself betrayed by your closest allies, a prisoner in your own castle, or worse, dead at the hands of those who wanted your crown. And while the nobility and kings fought their bloody political battles, the rest of the population had to live with the consequences. A noble's ambition could change the fate of entire villages, and a king's decision could spark a war that would last for decades, tearing apart lives and communities. But, as with everything in the medieval world, survival was a matter of endurance. It was about outlasting the chaos, waiting for the storm to pass, and hoping that you, your family, and your community would be there when it did. The thin line between life and death, violence as part of everyday life. In a world so consumed with survival, it's no surprise that violence was commonplace. It was present in every corner of medieval life, from the battlefields to the streets, from the royal courts to the villages. Violence was not just something you feared, it was something you lived with. The violence of medieval society wasn't limited to warfare, though. It was embedded in the very structure of the time. Criminals could be executed publicly, their deaths serving as both punishment and a spectacle for the crowd. Public executions were an event, attended by people from all walks of life. They were a reminder of the consequences of disobedience, a warning to anyone who might dare step out of line. There were no private executions here.
No quiet, dignified deaths.
Your death was a show for everyone to see, and if you were accused of something serious, heresy, witchcraft, or rebellion, you might find yourself subjected to trial by ordeal. These trials were barbaric and often deadly. In one form, you would have to retrieve a stone from a cauldron of boiling water. If your hand healed without infection, you were considered innocent. If not, you were guilty and likely to face a gruesome punishment. Another method involved being thrown into a river. If you sank, you were considered innocent, but you were most likely dead. If you floated, you were guilty, and your fate was sealed. This wasn't just a medieval practice, it was a reflection of the brutal, arbitrary justice that defined the era. There were no fair trials, no guarantees of innocence. Justice was not about truth or fairness. It was about survival of the fittest and often the most brutal. And if you survived the political and physical dangers of medieval life, there was one more threat waiting for you: the plague. The medieval world was plagued by constant outbreaks of disease, smallpox, cholera, and, of course, the Black Death. The plague was one of the deadliest forces of nature, wiping out entire cities and leaving a trail of death and despair in its wake. The Black Death alone killed between 30% to 60% of Europe's population. You didn't know when it would strike, or who would be taken by it. You just lived in constant fear of it, living with the uncertainty, the inescapable cycle of survival. And yet, despite all of this, the death, the violence, the uncertainty, life went on. You woke up each day, went through the motions, and survived. It wasn't about living a happy life or making a mark on the world. It was about survival, plain and simple. Each day was a battle to keep your head above water. You didn't know what the next day would bring, but you knew that if you didn't fight, you wouldn't survive. For the rich, Life might have been more comfortable, but it was no less dangerous. Nobles lived with the constant threat of rebellion, assassination, and political intrigue. Even kings, at the height of their power, had to contend with the possibility of betrayal from within their own courts. The middle class and lower classes didn't have the luxury of worrying about plots and power struggles. Their struggle was more immediate, whether they could feed their families, avoid sickness, and live through another year of labor and hardship. And yet, in all of this, there was a strange, quiet beauty. The beauty of survival, the beauty of the human spirit, which refused to be broken despite the weight of the world on its shoulders. People still found moments of joy, small pleasures like a warm meal, a well-made garment, or a moment of peace in the midst of the chaos. They found meaning in the most unexpected places. In their families, in their work, and even in their faith. And they lived as best they could, within the confines of a world that gave them no options but to endure. The weight of faith, religion as both shield and sword. If you've survived the endless labor, the violence, the brutality of the elements, and the constant uncertainty of life in the medieval world, you might find one source of stability in the most unexpected of places, religion. But faith, for all its comfort, wasn't just a refuge in these harsh times. It was a tool, a weapon in the hands of those in power, and a constant reminder of your place in the world. The church, both spiritual and political, dominated every aspect of your life. Every decision you made, from when to plant crops to whom you could marry, was influenced by the dictates of the church. In some ways, the medieval church was as powerful, if not more so, than the monarchs and lords who ruled over the land. It had the final say on matters of life and death. It wielded influence over your soul, your community, and, most tragically, your body. If you were born into the medieval world, the church was your constant companion. It was there in your birth, your marriage, and your death. The ringing of the bells each morning, noon, and evening reminded you not just to pray, but to know your place in the hierarchy of life and God's kingdom. The church's teachings weren't just about salvation, they were about obedience. Forgetting to bow at prayer time, eating meat on a Friday, or harboring sinful thoughts could have you branded a heretic, a sinner, or even a witch. The fear of hell, vivid and terrifying in its details, was a tool of control. Your afterlife wasn't a quiet, peaceful experience. According to the priests, you could expect rivers of fire, demons with pitchforks, and eternal wailing. In this world, the threat of eternal damnation loomed just as large as the threat of death. But it wasn't just fear that the church used to keep you in line. It was guilt, the kind that ran deep into your very soul. And yet, despite the constant pressure, the life of faith also had its redeeming qualities. In a world so filled with suffering, the church provided the only semblance of comfort. It promised peace in the afterlife, a world where suffering would end and salvation would begin. It offered rituals, prayers, and communal support to get you through the darkest days. In a society that left you to fend for yourself, it was one of the few institutions that could offer solace. But that solace wasn't free, came at a price. Your soul, your obedience, and often your wealth. Tithes were mandatory, a tenth of your income or produced to the church. If you didn't pay, you were spiritually bankrupt, even if you were financially poor. The church wasn't just about the care of your soul. It was about the control over your life, your body, and your actions. Even kings, noblemen, and lords feared the power of the church. Disagree with the clergy, and you risked losing your soul and your life. The price of dissent, heresy, and rebellion. But religion wasn't just about faith and obedience. It was also about control. When you dared to question it, to speak out, or to challenge the status quo, you risked far more than excommunication. Heresy was a crime that could cost you everything. To question the teachings of the church, to stray from its path, was to question not just your own soul but the very foundation of society. The church's hold on life, death, and law was absolute. Dissenters were hunted. Heretics were burned, sometimes alive. Witches were drowned or executed with cruelty. Trials for heresy were more than about religious differences. They were about political power. The church didn't just want your obedience. It wanted your unquestioning devotion. It wanted your life. And so, the medieval world was a place where fear and faith were intertwined. You could live in hope of salvation, but you could just as easily die in the flames for daring to question the truth as defined by those in power. Religion was your salvation and your sentence. It was both your shield and your sword, and it determined how you lived and how you died. Women marginalized, but unyielding. But there was one group that suffered most under this weight. Women. Life for women in medieval Europe wasn't just about surviving the physical hardships of the world. It was about surviving the immense social and cultural limitations imposed upon them. Women were second-class citizens in a world that demanded they conform to strict roles. From birth, they were expected to marry, bear children, and serve their husbands. There was little to no room for individual freedom. Education, for most women, was a distant dream. Only the daughters of the rich or powerful had access to knowledge. The rest were expected to tend to the household, the children, and the livestock. Their aspirations were buried under layers of expectation, duty, and the harsh realities of medieval life. But despite all of this, women found ways to assert themselves, even if it was in the smallest of ways. In a world that demanded silence, they spoke through their actions. They worked the fields, ran the households, and bore the weight of the family's survival. They learned herbal remedies, keeping the knowledge of healing in their hands. And even when they were accused of witchcraft or rebellion, they fought back, sometimes with their lives, but always with their spirits. There were those women who resisted in other ways, too. There were queens who took the throne in defiance of tradition, princesses who wielded power behind the scenes, and even humble women who, despite their roles, commanded the respect of those around them. Their stories are often lost to history, overshadowed by the more well-known tales of kings and knights. But their resilience, their ability to fight for their families, their communities, and their own survival is a testament to the strength of women in medieval society. Conclusion: a life of survival and resilience. And so, as you lie back at the end of your day, bruised, aching, and tired, you come to realize life in the medieval world was never about living well. It was about surviving. It was about outlasting the pain, the uncertainty, the violence, and the oppressive weight of the world. It was about finding small moments of meaning in a life that often seemed devoid of it. The medieval world was not a place for comfort or joy. It was a place where every moment could be your last, where power was held by a select few, and where death was always lurking just around the corner. But through it all, the people of the medieval world found ways to endure. They lived, they loved, they worked, and they died. And somehow, in the midst of it all, they created something beautiful. A testament to the human spirit, one that refused to be broken even when the world seemed intent on doing so. Tonight, as you sleep peacefully in your warm bed, remember those who came before you. Remember the peasants, the laborers, the women, and the children who lived and died in a world that offered them no comforts, no guarantees, no hope. And in doing so, remember the resilience of the human spirit, the one thing that can survive even the harshest of times, the enduring cycle, seasons of survival. As the day turns to night, another reality begins to settle in. The harsh cycle of seasons, each one with its own set of demands, dangers, and challenges. Life in the medieval world was not shaped by the clock, but by the rise and fall of the sun, the shift in the winds, and the changing of the seasons. The people of this time lived not by abstract notions of time, but by the seasons' tangible impact on their survival. In winter, the world shrank. The cold was relentless. Without the luxury of central heating, insulated walls, or even the ability to buy firewood whenever you wanted, you huddled near the hearth, trying to keep warm in a house that was little more than a drafty shell. If you were lucky, you had enough food to last through the cold months. But if the harvest had been poor or the grain supply had run out, you faced the very real possibility of starvation. The weak, the sick, the elderly, those who couldn't keep up with the rest, were the first to succumb to the harsh winter. Death didn't just come from disease or violence. It came from the seasons themselves. But even the winter, cruel as it was, could be a time of solidarity. People gathered in what little warmth they could find. Neighbors shared what they had, and the church offered sanctuary, both spiritually and physically. The church bell that rang each morning and evening wasn't just a call to prayer. It was a reminder that no one was truly alone in this fight for survival. The community, fragile as it might seem, was everything. And in the winter, more than ever, that sense of unity was what helped keep people going. Spring, a false hope. Spring was a season that brought its own set of contradictions. On the surface, it was a time of renewal. The earth thawed, the flowers bloomed, and the first crops began to grow. For a peasant or a farmer, spring was a season of hard labor. Fields had to be tilled, seeds sown, and the constant worry of frost and unpredictable weather loomed large. Spring meant hope, but it was a hope that came with the understanding that the future was never guaranteed. This was a time when people prayed for favorable weather, hoping for just the right amount of rain, the perfect balance of sun and cloud. Too much rain and the crops could rot. Too little and the seeds would never grow. Spring, though full of promise, was also full of uncertainty. The promise of food, of life, was never sure. The cycle of survival, the precarious balance between life and death, was a constant. But spring was also a time when the earth seemed to whisper a promise. Even amidst the backbreaking labor, there was the beauty of the world coming back to life. The vibrant green of the fields, the chirping of birds, the scent of fresh earth. It was a reminder that, despite everything, life had a way of renewing itself. Even in a world so filled with suffering, there were small joys. In the fields, in the gardens, and even in the fragile relationships of a medieval household, spring gave people something to hold on to. It was a brief, shining moment of hope before the real work began again. Summer, the furnace of the world. And then came summer, the furnace of the medieval world. The heat was oppressive, with no relief from the stifling air. Clothing, made of rough wool and linen, clung to the body, damp with sweat. The sun beat down relentlessly, and the work never ceased. For the peasants, summer meant the height of labor, harvests, the endless work in the fields, and the constant need for water. In a world where water was far from clean, the fight for hydration was just as dangerous as the fight for food. The summer heat was also the season of illness. Without the knowledge of germs or sanitation, disease thrived in the heat. The streets of towns became nothing more than open sewers, filled with human waste, rotting food, and the decaying bodies of animals. In the heat, the air became thick with the stench of death, as disease spread quickly through unsanitary conditions. And yet people still fought. Even as they sweated, even as they contracted fevers, they continued their work, because there was no other choice. Autumn, the reckoning. Then came autumn, a time that carried with it both the fruits of the labor and the impending reckoning. The harvest was either a blessing or a curse, depending on how the year had unfolded. If you were lucky, you had enough to carry you through the winter. But for most, autumn was a reminder of how fragile survival was. The end of the harvest season didn't just mark the end of the year. It marked the beginning of the end. The days grew shorter, the nights colder, and the uncertainty about the future only deepened. But there was something else about autumn that made it a significant season. The harvest festivals. They were brief, but they were also a time of release, a moment to pause and celebrate the year's work before the long winter settled in. These festivals, although small and simple, were an expression of life's resilience. Despite everything, despite the constant struggle to survive, the people of the medieval world still found moments of joy. They danced, they ate, they drank, and for a few brief days, they allowed themselves to forget the hardships that awaited them. The endless cycle of survival. And so the cycle continues. Winter turns to spring, spring to summer, and summer to autumn, each season bringing with it a new set of challenges and a new set of opportunities. But through it all, one thing remains constant: the fight for survival. Life in medieval Europe wasn't about living for the future. It was about surviving each day as it came. There was no room for dreams of the future. There was only the present, the struggle, the daily grind of trying to stay alive. It was a life marked by uncertainty, by suffering, and by an unrelenting will to keep going. But even in the darkest moments, even in the harshest seasons, the people of the medieval world found ways to endure. They found ways to keep going. The seasons might have been unforgiving, the work might have been backbreaking, and the dangers might have been constant, but they kept going because they had no other choice. And maybe, in the end, that was the greatest triumph of all. The will to survive, the quiet defiance against a world that seemed intent on breaking you. In the medieval world, you were never truly alone in your suffering. The land, the seasons, the people around you, they were all part of the same struggle. Together, you fought against the relentless forces of nature, politics, and death. And in that shared struggle, there was a kind of unity, a bond that held people together, even when everything else seemed to be falling apart. The battle for identity, the shaping of medieval society. If there's one thing that's clear about life in the medieval world, it's that identity was never something you created for yourself. It was something that was given to you. From the moment you were born, your place in society was assigned based on factors far beyond your control. Your gender, your birthright, your family's wealth, and the location of your birth. Your identity was inextricably linked to these circumstances, and your ability to shape your own life was limited by them. For peasants, your identity was forged in the fields, in the constant labor that marked your every day. You were defined by the work you did, the land you tended, and the Lord you served. There was no room for dreams, no time for ambitions. Your survival depended on your ability to meet the demands of the seasons, to endure the hardships of labor, and to support the system that kept you bound to the land. Even your sense of self-worth was tied to your usefulness to the community and your Lord. For women, identity was even more constrained. Their roles were defined by their relationships to the men around them. A woman's identity was molded by her father, her husband, and her children. Marriage was the ultimate marker of success, and a woman's worth was determined by her ability to bear children, to run a household, and to serve her family. There was no room for individuality, no room for personal desires. Women, for the most part, were seen as extensions of their fathers and husbands, their lives bound to the expectations of the men who held power over them. But there were exceptions. For some women, identity became something they could craft, albeit with immense difficulty. Queens, noble women, and occasionally women of the lower classes who had extraordinary talents found ways to carve out roles for themselves beyond the boundaries set for them. They used their wit, their charm, and sometimes their sheer force of will to redefine their place in society. But for most, that freedom was a distant dream, something that belonged only to the rare few who had the right connections or the right circumstances. The role of the church, a double-edged sword. Amidst the rigid social structures, one institution loomed large: the church. The medieval church was not just a religious body. It was a political one, an economic one, and an intellectual one. It shaped your world in every way imaginable, from the way you prayed to the way you worked to the way you thought about your place in the universe. At its best, the church offered comfort and solace. It promised a life after death that was free from the suffering of the mortal world. For those who lived in constant fear of death, whether from plague, famine, or violence, the church offered a lifeline. It gave meaning to suffering, a reason for the endless cycle of hardship. It provided a structure for the world, offering a clear path of right and wrong, a set of rules that governed not just how you should live, but how you should die. But at its worst, the church was an oppressive force. It enforced the social hierarchies of the medieval world, reinforcing the power of the nobility and the monarchy while keeping the lower classes in check. It was an institution that justified cruelty and inequality, using the fear of hellfire to control the masses. Heretics, witches, and anyone who dared to challenge the church's authority were punished severely, often with their lives. In a world so defined by suffering, the church was both a refuge and a weapon. It could provide you with comfort and guidance, but it could also strip you of your humanity, reducing you to nothing more than a soul to be saved or condemned. And for women, the church's teachings were even more restrictive. It reinforced their subservience, making them believe that their place in the world was beneath men and that their only hope for salvation lay in their obedience and submission. But even within the rigid boundaries set by the church, there were moments of defiance. The women who defied their roles, who challenged the expectations of the church and society, created their own identities. They were outcasts, rebels, and sometimes martyrs, but their stories were a testament to the human spirit's refusal to be completely crushed. In their own way, these women created a space for themselves in a world that told them they didn't belong. The struggle for freedom, rebellion and resistance. Despite the weight of the church, the monarchy, and the social system that bound people to their roles, there were always those who resisted. There were peasants who fought against the oppression of their lords, rebellious knights who defied their monarchs, and women who fought for their own rights, even if it meant facing persecution. In the medieval world, rebellion didn't always come in the form of large-scale revolutions. Sometimes it came in the quiet acts of defiance that occurred every day. A peasant who refused to work for his lord. A woman who decided to take her own path instead of marrying for status. A knight who, rather than serving his king's war, chose to live by his own code of honor. These acts, though small, were a form of resistance against the system that sought to control every aspect of life. The most famous rebellions, of course, were the ones that grew into full-scale uprisings. Movements like the Peasants' Revolt in England, the 100 Years' War between England and France, and the various religious uprisings that shook the foundations of medieval society. These were desperate struggles for survival as much as for freedom. They were the desperate cries of people who had nothing left to lose, who had suffered under the weight of an oppressive system for too long. But even in these large movements, it was the individuals, the small acts of defiance that mattered. It was the rebel who refused to kneel before the king, the woman who stood tall despite society's attempt to crush her, the peasant who spoke out against the tyranny of his lord. They were the ones who, even in the darkest times, kept the flame of hope alive. Conclusion: a life shaped by struggle and defiance. So, as you settle into your quiet, peaceful life, remember that the medieval world wasn't a place of castles and knights, but a world shaped by struggle. It was a world where survival was the ultimate goal, and identity was something that was fought for, not given. It was a world where power was held by a few, but fought for by many. And it was a world where, even in the harshest conditions, the human spirit found a way to survive, to fight, and to resist. The medieval era was brutal, unforgiving, and, at times, soul-crushing. But in the midst of it all, there were moments of defiance, of hope, and of resilience. The peasants, the women, the rebels, they are the unsung heroes of this time. Their lives may have been short, their struggles often forgotten, but their spirit endured. And it's that spirit that lives on, long after the castles have crumbled and the knights have faded into legend. The weight of power, nobility and royalty in the medieval world. In a world that seemed to be defined by poverty, labor, and suffering, there was another world that lived in stark contrast, the world of the nobility. It was a world of power, luxury, and control. a world where birthright determined your place, and your wealth was a symbol of your authority. But even in this world, life was not free from struggle. The nobility, too, had their own battles to fight. Nobles were not just the landowners. They were the enforcers of the system. They were the ones who maintained the order, the ones who collected taxes, who commanded armies, and who determined the fate of the peasants who worked their lands. Their wealth and power were rooted in the labor of others. But despite their privileged position, they were not immune to the brutality of the medieval world. They, too, faced wars, betrayals, and the constant fear of losing their status. While peasants labored in the fields, nobles spent their days in castles, their lives governed by a different set of rules. They had access to food, comfort, and security. They wore fine clothes, ate rich meals, and enjoyed the luxury of having others do the work for them. But even in the safety of their castles, nobles were not truly safe. The constant threat of rebellion, assassination, and political intrigue hung over their heads. Noble life was defined by a code of honor. Chivalry, a complex system of ideals, governed the behavior of knights and lords alike. The code dictated everything from how they treated women to how they fought in battle. But it was more than just a set of rules. It was a way of life, a way to maintain control and justify power. The nobility, though they lived in relative luxury compared to peasants, were also trapped by their roles. They had to uphold the ideals of chivalry, to maintain their estates, and to protect their bloodlines. Failure to do so could result in disgrace, loss of power, and even death. For the women of the nobility, the rules were just as strict, but in a different way. They were valued for their beauty, their grace, and their ability to bear children, particularly male heirs. A noblewoman's worth was often tied to her ability to secure advantageous marriages, to further her family's status, and to produce heirs who would inherit the family's land and titles. But unlike their male counterparts, noblewomen had little to no power in the political realm. They were often confined to their homes, their influence limited to the private sphere. Despite this, many noblewomen were able to exert power in subtle ways. Some became regents for their young sons, ruling in their stead until they were old enough to take the throne. Others wielded power behind the scenes, using their influence to broker political alliances or protect their families. While their lives were defined by the same rigid structures as their male counterparts, they found ways to bend the rules and carve out their own spaces of power. The weight of war, constant battles and uncertainty. For all their wealth and power, the nobility lived in constant uncertainty. Wars were frequent, often fought over territory, religion, or political control. Kings and lords fought one another for land, power, and prestige, and the medieval battlefield was a place of brutal violence. While the nobility often had the luxury of strategizing from the safety of their castles, they were not immune to the dangers of war. Kings were often killed in battle, lords lost their land and wealth, and knights were maimed or killed fighting for causes that had little to do with their own survival. The Middle Ages were not a peaceful time. The constant threat of war, of raids, of invasions, and the ever-present specter of death defined the lives of both peasants and nobility alike. But while peasants fought for survival, the nobility fought for control. Theirs was a battle for dominance, for maintaining their place at the top of the social hierarchy. And for every victory won, There was a price to pay, a price often paid in blood, in lives lost, and in kingdoms conquered or lost. In times of war, the nobility were expected to lead their troops into battle, to fight with honor and valor. A knight's reputation was built not just on his wealth or his lineage, but on his ability to fight and to win. The battlefield was where they proved their worth, where they earned their place in the world. But even the nobility were not guaranteed victory. Battles were unpredictable, and a single loss could undo years of work, of alliances, and of power. For many, the fear of losing everything in battle was just as real as the fear of famine or plague. The weight of wealth, the burden of riches. Wealth, for all its advantages, came with its own burdens. The nobility may have lived in comfort, but they were also responsible for the upkeep of their estates. The land had to be worked, the peasants had to be fed, and the castle had to be maintained. The noble class was constantly concerned with preserving their wealth, with ensuring that their family status remained intact. This meant constant vigilance, constant planning, and constant negotiations. Nobles didn't just sit idly on their lands, collecting rents and taxes. They were active participants in the political and economic life of the kingdom. They worked to maintain their relationships with other nobles, with the king, and with the church. Their wealth was often tied to the land they owned, and land was both an asset and a liability. To own land was to own power, but it was also to carry the responsibility of protecting it. For many nobles, the drive to accumulate wealth was about more than just comfort. It was about survival. A noble family could go bankrupt, their land lost to their rivals, their wealth dissipating in a single bad harvest or a poorly executed political alliance. And so, the wealthiest families were always working to secure their position, to expand their holdings, and to ensure that their children would inherit a prosperous estate. The weight of legacy, the burden of family. Above all else, the nobility were defined by their legacy. The family name was everything. It was what they fought for, what they worked for, and what they lived for. In a world that was so focused on power and status, family was the ultimate symbol of achievement. A noble family's wealth, land, and titles were passed down through generations, ensuring that the family name would continue. But the burden of legacy was not just about preserving wealth or land. It was about preserving the family's honor and reputation. The family name could be destroyed by a single scandal, a single mistake, or a single defeat in battle. And so, the nobility were constantly working to protect their name, to ensure that their legacy would endure. For noble women, the burden of legacy was even more pronounced. They were often the vessels through which the family's name was passed on. Their worth was tied to their ability to produce heirs, particularly male heirs who would inherit the family estate. The pressure to marry well, to secure the right alliances, and to bear children weighed heavily on noble women, shaping their lives in ways that were often invisible to those outside their world. Conclusion: the paradox of power. The medieval nobility, for all their wealth and power, lived in a world defined by struggle, uncertainty, and constant vigilance. They were not free from the hardships of the medieval world. They were simply better equipped to handle them. Theirs was a world of political intrigue, military conquest, and the constant need to protect and preserve their status. But despite their power, they, too, were bound by the rigid structures of medieval society, by the expectations of their family, their king, and the church. The nobility may have lived in comfort, but they, too, were caught in the relentless cycle of survival, fighting not just for food or shelter, but for their place in the social hierarchy. They lived with the knowledge that their power could be taken away in an instant, that their wealth could evaporate, and that their legacy could be erased by a single misstep. The medieval world, for all its focus on nobility and royalty, was a world where no one was truly safe, where survival was always a matter of chance, and where even the most powerful could fall. As you think about the nobility of the medieval world, remember that their lives were not defined solely by wealth or power. They, too, were shaped by the same forces that governed the lives of peasants and common folk: the seasons, the land, the church, and the ever-present fear of death. The nobility were not gods. They were merely men and women who lived under the same harsh rules that governed everyone else, fighting for survival in a world that offered no guarantees. The pulse of the people, life in the streets and homes of medieval Europe. Now let's return to the heart of medieval life: the streets, the towns, the homes, and the people who inhabited them. The life of a peasant, a common laborer, a craftsman, or even a member of the burgeoning middle class was radically different from that of the nobility. Yet, despite the class divides, their world was just as harsh, just as fraught with uncertainty, and just as shaped by the natural world around them. In a bustling medieval town, the streets were filled with noise, carriages rattling over cobblestones, the clatter of hammers on anvils, the chatter of merchants hawking their wares, and the bleating of animals. These streets were a tapestry of life, vibrant yet sometimes chaotic. People crowded together not just for business, but because they had no choice. The town was their world. If you lived there, you worked there, you played there, and you suffered there. There was no separation between work and home. Everything was lived in close quarters. The air was thick with the smell of fresh bread, fish, human sweat, and the occasional animal waste. Most of the homes in medieval towns were small, crowded, and basic. You didn't have much space, just a tiny, one-room house that served as everything from living quarters to sleeping space to storage for food and tools. For the wealthier citizens, such as merchants or small landowners, their homes may have been a bit larger, with a few more rooms or a bit of decoration. But for the common folk, the home was little more than a shelter. The hearth was the center of the house, the source of warmth, light, and the primary place to cook. It was also a constant reminder of how close death and destruction were. A single ember that escaped the hearth could set the whole house ablaze, and given the cramped conditions, fires were a constant worry. The floors were often dirt or rough stone, and windows were small, sometimes no more than slits in the walls. Light was scarce, especially on cloudy days, and privacy was a luxury most didn't have. Families shared everything: space, food, work, and even their most personal moments. There was no real concept of personal space in the medieval world. People were in close contact with one another at all times, often in ways that might seem unimaginable today. The days were long and hard, beginning at dawn when the rooster crowed and ending long after the sun dipped below the horizon. But it wasn't all work and no play. The streets buzzed with life, with sounds of children playing games in the alleys, vendors singing out their wares, and the town crier making his rounds with the latest news or proclamations from the local lord. It was a society built on relationships. Everyone knew everyone else, and the rhythms of life were dictated by the needs of the community. You couldn't survive without helping your neighbors, and they couldn't survive without you. But this shared sense of survival often came with a heavy cost. Disease, for instance, was rampant in medieval towns. Without the understanding of germs or hygiene, sickness spread quickly through crowded streets and homes. The Black Death, which would come sweeping through Europe in the 14th century, would decimate the population, leaving entire towns empty and entire families wiped out. But even before that, illnesses like dysentery, cholera, and the ever-present threat of plague made daily life a matter of survival. People lived in constant fear of illness, and when someone in the community fell ill, it was a reminder that anyone could be next. The weight of work, labor, and craftsmanship in a medieval town. For most of the population, the day began with a relentless series of tasks. Work, work, work. You were a farmer, a blacksmith, a tailor, a brewer, or any number of trades. Work was the thing that defined your life, and your success or failure in your trade would often determine whether you and your family survived another season. Work in a medieval town was hands-on. If you were a farmer, you spent your day in the fields, tilling the soil with primitive tools, planting, tending, and harvesting crops. It was exhausting labor that required long hours under the sun, bending over from dawn until dusk. Even with oxen or horses to help plow the fields, much of the work still fell to your hands. And after the harvest came the work of storing food for the winter, preserving grains, vegetables, and meats. If the harvest was good, you would have enough to eat through the cold months. If it was bad, you might face starvation. But for those who lived in the towns, the work was equally grueling, though it was often based around craftsmanship. Blacksmiths spent hours hammering out metal in a hot, smoky forge, crafting tools and weapons that were sold in the market. Carpenters built everything from furniture to homes, shaping wood into useful items with little more than basic tools. Weavers and tailors worked from dawn until night, creating clothes for everyone from the nobility to the poorest of townsfolk. Each job, though necessary for the survival of the town, was demanding and fraught with danger. Even for those who worked in less physically demanding jobs, life was far from easy. Merchants who sold goods had to spend hours haggling in the market, and the constant competition made business unpredictable. If you ran a tavern or a bakery, your days began early and ended late. You lived with the constant fear of theft, of losing your goods, or of not making enough money to feed your family. In medieval times, there was no concept of a weekend. There were no breaks. If you were lucky, you might have a Sunday off for church, but that didn't mean you could sleep in or take a leisurely stroll. The church bells rang early in the morning to remind you to pray, and then it was back to work. Even if you were sick or injured, you had to work. There was no sick leave, no insurance, and no way to take time off without risking your family's survival. People worked until their bodies broke, often dying in their 30s or 40s from exhaustion, disease, or injury. The strength of faith, religion in daily life. In medieval Europe, faith was at the center of everything. Life revolved around the church. The church's influence reached into every corner of daily life, from the laws that governed the kingdom to the festivals that marked the calendar. It was not just a place to worship. It was a place of social gathering, a school, and a source of law and order. For most people, The church was the source of comfort and the way to connect with the divine. Prayers were said every day, and masses were attended regularly. The idea of salvation was central to medieval thought. Suffering in this life would lead to a better life in the next, but only if you lived according to the rules of the church. Religion was not just a belief, it was a way of life. Without the guidance of the church, many people felt they would be lost. But it was also a double-edged sword. The church had immense power over the lives of common people. The threat of damnation was a powerful tool in controlling behavior. The church's power to excommunicate individuals or entire villages kept the masses in check. Fear of eternal damnation made the church's teachings hard to question, and the local priests held power over many aspects of daily life, including who was allowed to marry, who could own land, and who could participate in certain community activities. Yet, for all its power and control, the church was also a place of hope, of sanctuary from the harsh realities of the world. People believed in miracles, and they looked to saints and relics for healing and guidance. Pilgrimages to holy sites were a significant part of medieval life, offering the opportunity for both spiritual renewal and the possibility of physical healing. In a world defined by suffering, the church offered something more, a belief that, even in the harshest times, there was a divine plan that would guide the faithful to salvation. Conclusion: the medieval world in context. The medieval world was a harsh one, defined by struggle, uncertainty, and hardship. Whether you were a peasant, a craftsman, or a noble, life was shaped by the seasons, the demands of work, the control of the church, and the ever-present shadow of death. Yet, in the midst of all this, people found ways to live, to survive, and even to thrive. Their strength lay not in their wealth, but in their resilience. In a world where survival was never guaranteed, the will to live was what mattered most. In the medieval world, survival wasn't just about avoiding death. It was about living through the difficulties, fighting against the odds, and finding meaning in the struggle. And perhaps that, more than anything, is what the medieval world teaches us. That even in the most brutal circumstances, human beings have an incredible capacity to endure, to create, and to hope. And in that hope, there lies the true story of the Middle Ages, the tapestry of survival. Daily life in the medieval world. In medieval Europe, the days bled into one another in a haze of work, faith, and the struggle to survive. The hum of daily life was often drowned out by the clang of farm tools, the cries of infants, and the constant pressure of a world that offered few reprieves. Yet, even within the hard edges of this existence, there were moments of community, of family, and of hope. For every struggle against the elements, for every long night spent fighting illness or hunger, there was the pulse of life, a sense of perseverance that kept people going day after day. Imagine yourself in the thick of it, the smell of wet earth after rain, the crunch of boots on frozen ground, the rhythmic churning of a wheel turning grains into flour. Whether you worked the land or worked in the bustling streets of the town, the world you lived in was constantly shifting, constantly moving, driven by forces both human and natural. The medieval world, for all its brutality, was alive with the energy of survival. And at its core, that was the great human endeavor to survive and perhaps to thrive. The lives of the laborers, from dawn to dusk. For the majority of people, survival was a matter of labor, and labor was never-ending. In the countryside, the life of a peasant was a constant cycle. Each day began with the first light of dawn, the rooster crowing signaling that it was time to rise, even before the sun itself had fully emerged. The workday stretched out before them, filled with the endless demands of the land. Plowing, sowing, weeding, harvesting, tasks that never ceased because the seasons dictated them. The tools they used were rudimentary, often crafted by hand and rough in design. A plow might be drawn by oxen or horses, and hoes were made of wood, sometimes reinforced with metal. Every day, every task was a reminder of their place in the world. For the land was their life, and the land was never forgiving. One bad season could spell disaster. Crop failures, bad weather, or raids from neighboring villages could ruin a year's work in an instant. In the towns, the rhythm of life was just as demanding but often more varied. Craftsmen labored long hours, their work defined by their trade. A blacksmith, hammering away in the forge, could spend hours shaping iron into nails, plows, or weapons. A weaver would sit at her loom, hands moving with the practiced grace of someone who had spent years perfecting her craft, turning thread into fabric that would be worn by peasants and nobles alike. Tailors stitched garments, their needles flashing in the flickering light of a candle, while bakers spent their days kneading dough and baking bread to feed the masses. The sweat of their labor was their currency. A day's work meant a day's survival, but it also meant connection to the community. Towns were places where people knew each other, where a shared meal or a friendly conversation might ease the tensions of a hard day. Even in the grind of constant labor, there was room for the exchange of stories, for laughter shared at the market, for friendships formed in the common struggle. But work was never easy. For all the camaraderie and community, the physical toll of constant labor left its mark. Hands became calloused, backs bent under the weight of too many years spent in fields or workshops. Illness and injury were ever present, and without the medical knowledge we take for granted today, minor injuries could become life-threatening. But still, they worked because there was no other choice. The burden of belief, religion in every moment. Life in medieval Europe was also deeply entwined with faith. For peasants and nobles alike, religion shaped every aspect of life, from birth to death. The church was a constant presence, both as a spiritual guide and a political power. It controlled much of the land, it was a source of law, and it provided an order to the world that made sense to a people who often found themselves at the mercy of forces they could not control. The bells of the local church rang frequently, calling people to prayer, to mass, or to mark significant events in the year. Festivals were a part of life, and each feast day celebrated a particular saint or aspect of Christian belief. But the church wasn't just a place for worship, it was a place for community. The poor would turn to the local priest not just for guidance in the afterlife, but for practical matters like marriages, births, and even disputes with neighbors. It was a social glue that bound together a world of otherwise isolated individuals. But religion also acted as a form of control. The church dictated not only spiritual matters but moral ones as well. Laws were made with religious doctrine in mind, and the fear of damnation kept people in line. Sin was a constant threat, and for many, It was easier to live by the rules of the church than to risk eternal punishment. The concept of hell, with its rivers of fire and eternal suffering, loomed large in the medieval mind, and the clergy made sure that everyone understood the importance of following the religious codes of conduct. For the nobility, the church was a source of power as much as it was a place of worship. Kings and queens sought the favor of the pope, and the legitimacy of a ruler often came down to whether or not the church recognized them. But even in the courts of the rich and powerful, religion shaped every decision. The church had power over marriage, succession, and even the distribution of wealth. The nobility may have held political power, but the church held the keys to salvation. The community, struggles and survival together. Despite the harshness of medieval life, it was also a time of deep communal bonds. The concept of community was not just social but deeply rooted in the need for survival. People helped one another because they had to. A neighbor's crop failure could be a village-wide problem, and the death of one person could send ripples through the entire town. But it wasn't just survival that bound people together. It was shared experiences. Holidays, though often centered around religious observance, were times for feasting, for celebrating the harvest, and for marking milestones in life. Weddings, births, and funerals were social events as much as they were spiritual ones. People came together not just as neighbors, but as a collective, united by the shared struggle of living in a world that could turn on them in an instant. The bonds of family were also critical. In a time when infant mortality rates were high and life expectancy was low, family was everything. Family provided support, protection, and the continuity of traditions. A family was the backbone of society, and the ties between parents and children were unbreakable. The family unit was everything, and it was in the home where many of life's important lessons were taught. The shadow of death, life's impermanence. And yet, through it all, the shadow of death loomed large. Medieval life was punctuated by moments of suffering, whether from illness, famine, or war. The reality of life during this time was that survival was never guaranteed. The high mortality rates, the diseases that spread like wildfire, and the brutal realities of medieval warfare meant that death was never far away. Life was fragile in the Middle Ages, and people lived with the knowledge that at any moment, their life could be taken from them. The Black Death, which swept across Europe in the mid-14th century, wiped out nearly a third of the population, and for many, this loss was a reminder of how tenuous their existence was. Disease, warfare, and the constant threat of violence kept people in a state of constant awareness that life could be interrupted at any moment. And yet they lived, they fought, they survived. The human capacity to endure, to find meaning in hardship, and to keep going despite overwhelming odds is perhaps one of the greatest legacies of the Middle Ages. Conclusion: a world built on struggle and resilience. Life in medieval Europe was not easy. It was a world of constant struggle, against the elements, against disease, against the tyranny of the seasons, and against the harshness of class divides. But it was also a world of profound resilience. People lived with a quiet, unspoken determination to survive, and even in the face of suffering, they found moments of joy, of community, and of hope. The medieval world may have been defined by hardship, but it was also defined by the strength of its people. And it is in that strength, in their ability to carry on, that the true heart of the medieval world beats. The pulse of the medieval world, struggles, community, and resilience, step into the medieval world, where the air is thick with the smell of earth, animals, and fire. A world where survival is not a given, and every day is an uphill battle against nature, disease, and the often unyielding structures of society. In this time, there are no shortcuts to life, no easy street, only the hard, tireless work of existence. But amidst the muck and the toil, life flourished in its own way. For every sword swung in battle, there was a shared laugh at the market. For every plague that swept through the villages, there were weddings, births, and moments of love that reminded people of their humanity. The medieval world, though brutal, was defined by its resilience. People didn't just endure. They lived. They built communities. They told stories. They celebrated life as best they could. And they did it together. The rhythm of survival. Work and labor in a medieval day. There's no mistaking it. Life in the medieval world was one of hard labor. If you lived in the countryside, the land was your master. And for the majority of the population, it was the land that determined their fate. A farmer's day started long before the sun rose, the rooster's cry pulling them from whatever small rest they could manage. Their hands, calloused and worn, were ready for the brutal grind of the day. If you were lucky enough to have an ox or a horse, they'd help you plow the land. But whether you had animals or not, the work was grueling. Digging, sowing, weeding, and then, after months of labor, harvesting. The seasons ruled over the work of the land, and each year brought the uncertainty of whether you'd be able to feed your family. But the peasants weren't alone in their labor. Townspeople, blacksmiths, weavers, bakers, and carpenters spent their days bent over their workbenches, crafting the tools, clothes, and food that everyone depended on. These tradespeople had it no easier. The work was long, tedious, and often dangerous, with few protections for injury. Blacksmiths, working in the hot forge, hammered metal for hours, day in and day out, while carpenters and masons built the houses, bridges, and churches that defined medieval towns. If you were lucky enough to work with your hands in the city, you likely enjoyed a little more variety in your work than the farmer. But for all the comfort of a roof over your head and access to the marketplace, the hours were long and the pay was meager. If you were a craftsman, your survival depended on being able to outwork your neighbors, but also on luck. A bad year meant few customers, or bad harvests meant fewer goods to sell. Community bonds, shared struggles, and the strength of togetherness. In the medieval world, you were never really alone, not in the way we think of solitude today. While it's easy to imagine the Middle Ages as a solitary struggle, where the poor worked the land while the rich sat in their castles, untouched by the hardships below, that view misses the essence of medieval life. People lived in communities, and those communities thrived on the shared experiences of work, of hardship, and sometimes of joy. The villages and towns were small, tight-knit places, and survival depended on everyone playing their part. If you were a farmer, you didn't just work your own land, you helped your neighbor with theirs, especially during harvest season. There was an unspoken understanding. Your survival depended on theirs. If a neighbor's field was struck by disease, it could be a matter of life and death for you, too. The same went for artisans. A craftsman could sell his goods to others in his town, but if the neighboring blacksmith had a poor harvest, his ability to purchase goods would dwindle, affecting the local economy. This interdependence bred solidarity, but also competition. The medieval economy was a harsh one, and even within the close-knit communities, there was the ever-present anxiety that one wrong move, one bad season, could bring everything crashing down. For all the shared experience of working side by side, there was still the constant pressure of making sure you stayed above the poverty line. Yet even in the hardest moments, people found ways to connect. The church, with its regular mass services, was a place of refuge from the brutalities of the world. It wasn't just a place to worship, it was a place to socialize, to share news, and to find solace. Markets, fairs, and festivals also brought communities together, providing a rare reprieve from the demands of the land. Despite the ever-present struggle, medieval communities were rich with cultural traditions that tied people to their land, to their families, and to one another. These traditions, from the celebrations of harvest to the rites of passage marked by marriages and births, were a reminder of what people lived for. The cycle of life, death, and renewal played out not just in the fields but in the hearts of the people. Faith and fear, the central role of religion. No aspect of medieval life was more pervasive than religion. The church held more power than any noble house, and its influence stretched from the smallest village to the highest court. Faith was not a choice but a cornerstone of medieval life. Every major event, birth, marriage, death, was sanctioned by the church, and it was the priest who performed the rites that marked these events. The fear of damnation was real for the people of medieval Europe. Hell, with its rivers of fire, demons, and eternal suffering, was not just a theological concept. It was a living, breathing threat. The church's sermons were laced with reminders of humanity's fragility, and for many, the knowledge that their actions on earth would determine their fate in the afterlife kept them tethered to the faith. The church also served as a form of social control. It dictated the moral laws of society, and its reach was extensive. Heresy was a dangerous charge. Accusations of witchcraft, rebellion, or deviating from church teachings were punishable by death. Trials by ordeal or fire were used to determine guilt or innocence, and if you were unlucky enough to fall afoul of the church's dogma, your fate could be sealed with a public execution, witnessed by all. Yet, for all its power and control, the church was also a source of comfort. It provided a framework for understanding the world, a sense of hope amid the daily grind. It offered a promise of salvation, a belief that if you lived rightly, you would be rewarded in the next life. For peasants and townsfolk alike, this promise was a light in a world so often shadowed by illness, war, and poverty. The fragility of life, disease and death in a harsh world. While faith offered solace, the reality of life in the medieval world was much harsher. Disease was rampant, and with no understanding of germ theory, the people of medieval Europe were constantly at the mercy of invisible forces. Plagues such as the Black Death wiped out entire villages, and illnesses like dysentery, smallpox, and cholera could strike without warning, often killing without mercy. Death was a constant companion. People lived with the knowledge that their lives were fragile, that a simple infection could lead to their untimely demise. The death rate was high, particularly among infants and young children, and families were often left grieving the loss of loved ones. The high mortality rate, combined with the regular threat of war and famine, meant that the people of the Middle Ages were constantly reminded of the impermanence of life. But even in the face of death, there was an overwhelming will to survive. People continued to work the land, raise their families, and worship their gods, even as the shadow of death loomed large over their heads. The endurance of the human spirit. Medieval Europe was a world of contradictions. It was a time of great beauty and immense suffering, of communal bonds and personal struggles, of deep faith and constant fear. But what truly defined this era was the resilience of its people. For all the hardships they faced, they found ways to survive, to love, to build, and to dream. In the midst of disease, famine, and war, medieval men and women carved out lives that were meaningful, that were connected to each other, and that were driven by the hope that tomorrow might be better. The medieval world was not a place of ease. It was a place of endurance. And in that endurance, there is a lesson that still resonates today. No matter the odds, no matter the struggle, the human spirit has a remarkable ability to press forward. A glimpse into the medieval world. Struggles, survival, and solidarity. Close your eyes and imagine the world of the Middle Ages. It's the year 1325, and the air is thick with the scent of damp earth and with smoke. The sun barely rises above the horizon as the rooster's crow pierces the early morning stillness. It's cold, it's grim, and it's the beginning of another long day where every hour is a battle for survival. This is the world of medieval Europe, where life is often harsh, but where human resilience prevails in the face of insurmountable odds. The castles and grand halls we associate with medieval tales are not the full picture. This world is lived in humble cottages and small villages, where the overwhelming majority of people toil endlessly just to make it through another day. The life of a peasant is one marked by labor, a life spent working the land for a feudal lord, often with little more than a meager existence to show for it. But amid the grime and the struggle, the medieval world was alive with moments of human connection. It was a world of community, of faith, and, perhaps above all, survival. And survival meant working together, even when there was no guarantee of a better tomorrow. The daily grind, work, and labor in the medieval world. Imagine you're a peasant. Your day starts before the sun has fully risen. The rooster's crow, a reminder that it's time to face the day. You wake on a straw mattress that smells like hay and animal waste, sharing the space with your family, livestock, and perhaps a few more relatives who never quite left after visiting. There's no privacy, no space to call your own. The air is thick with the smells of earth, sweat, and the constant low hum of survival. You stretch your aching limbs, your body stiff from the work of the day before. Your job today is simple: survive. The fields are waiting, and there's no time to waste. The weather, the seasons, and the very land you work with have no mercy. The work is physical, repetitive, and constant. You plow the fields with a rudimentary plow, drawn by oxen or, if you're fortunate, a horse. The harvest, too, is grueling. Long hours in the sun, hauling grain, sorting crops, and working until the muscles in your back beg for rest. But rest is fleeting. There's always more to do. For the vast majority of medieval Europeans, life was work. If you were lucky enough to live in a town, perhaps as a blacksmith, a tailor, or a merchant, there was still the same relentless cycle of labor. The work might be different, but it was no less exhausting. Each day brought a new challenge, whether it was forging iron into tools, mending clothes, or trading goods. No matter where you were, no matter what your trade, survival came down to your ability to work and to keep working. Life in the village. The power of community. Life in the medieval village was a balancing act. Everyone relied on everyone else. The fields were worked together, food was shared, and even the most mundane tasks were often done in concert with neighbors. The bond of community was essential for survival. If the crops failed in one field, it affected everyone. If one person fell ill, the village would do what it could to care for them. You were only as strong as the community around you, and there was always a sense of unspoken solidarity, even in the toughest of times. Towns and villages were built around the church, which served as both a place of worship and a social gathering point. Religion in the medieval world wasn't just about prayer. It was the glue that held society together. The church provided a moral framework, a sense of structure, and a way to make sense of a world that was often chaotic and cruel. The church bells rang regularly, not just to mark time, but to remind everyone of their shared responsibility to each other and to God. Life in the village was a shared experience, full of ritual and tradition. The harvest festivals, the weekly market, the celebrations of saints' days. These were not just religious observances. They were moments to come together, to rest, and to remember that, despite the grind of daily survival, life still had its joys. You didn't always have the luxury of comfort, but you had something far more important: connection. In a world where most people would never travel beyond a few miles from home, your village, your neighbors, and your family were everything. Faith, fear, and the church. A life defined by religion. Religion wasn't just a part of life in the Middle Ages, it was the very core of existence. The church shaped everything from your birth to your death, from your work to your leisure. You weren't just born into a family, you were born into a faith, and that faith dictated your place in the world. The fear of damnation was never far from the mind. Hell was a very real place in the medieval imagination, a place of fire and brimstone, where sinners were condemned to eternal suffering. The fear of this fate was woven into the fabric of everyday life. The church taught that salvation was possible, but it was earned through piety, good works, and faith in God. For many peasants, this belief was a lifeline, an assurance that their struggles were not in vain, that there was something better waiting for them after death. But the church also held power. It owned land, dictated laws, and influenced kings and nobles. The clergy held authority over life's most important moments: weddings, baptisms, deaths, and those who strayed from the path of righteousness could find themselves excommunicated, ostracized, or worse. The church's power was absolute, its reach far and wide. The fear of God's wrath was coupled with the very real threat of the church's punishment. But even with this looming threat, the church was also a place of comfort. People turned to their priests not only for guidance in the afterlife, but for support in their daily lives. Priests performed services, blessed homes, and even settled disputes. For the peasant, the church was not just a spiritual haven. It was a source of stability in an otherwise unstable world. Survival and suffering, death in the medieval world. But for all its structure, life in the Middle Ages was fragile. Disease, famine, and war were constant threats. The Black Death alone killed an estimated third of Europe's population. And for those who survived, death was a daily possibility. Illnesses that are now easily treated could take a life in a matter of days. And while the rich had some means of escaping disease or war, the poor had no such luxury. Death was a constant companion. Plagues would sweep through towns with terrifying speed, and wars could devastate entire regions. Yet even with the ever-present fear of death, people lived. They worked, they loved, they fought, and they celebrated. There was no illusion of control, but there was a fierce determination to make it through, to endure. And endure they did. Even in a world where survival was never guaranteed, there were moments of joy, moments of connection, and moments where the sheer will to live kept people going. The medieval world, for all its harshness, was full of people who refused to be broken, who held onto their faith, their community, and their humanity. Conclusion: resilience amidst adversity. The medieval world was not kind, but it was alive. It was a world defined by struggle, but also by solidarity. It was a world where faith held people together and where survival depended on the collective strength of the community. People lived their lives not with the certainty of ease, but with the quiet resilience of those who knew that life, for all its hardships, was worth living. In the midst of the muck, the death, and the struggle, people in the Middle Ages found ways to endure. They worked the land, raised families, built communities, and leaned on their faith to see them through. The medieval world may have been brutal, but it was also a testament to the strength of the human spirit. And it is in this strength, this enduring will to survive, that we find the heart of the medieval world. A day in the life, the struggles and resilience of the medieval world. Imagine waking up in the year 1325. The first sound you hear is the distant toll of the church bell, a harsh reminder that the day has already begun. It's cold, and the air smells faintly of damp earth, wood, and something unpleasantly sour. You open your eyes, blinking at the pale light filtering in through cracks in the wall. Your bed, a straw mattress stuffed with hay, creaks beneath you as you stretch, feeling every ache in your body. There are no modern comforts, no soft sheets, no memory foam mattress. Just the hard reality of survival. You push yourself out of bed and immediately feel the chill of the stone floor beneath your feet. The floor is damp, either from the night's rain or the leaking roof above. The smell of the room hits you. Stale beer, animal dung, sweat, and the faint, pungent odor of unwashed bodies. There's no privacy here. Your family, your livestock, and the occasional cousin who has overstayed their welcome all share this cramped space. This is not a life of luxury. It's a life of hardship, of endless labor, and of constant struggle against the elements and disease. But it's also a life of community, of survival, and of small moments of joy. In the medieval world, there's no such thing as easy living. Every day is a fight for survival, but it's a fight people have been living through for centuries. The daily grind, work, and labor. Your first task of the day is simple: get to work. And in the medieval world, work doesn't stop. The fields are calling, and the day's labor will stretch from dawn until dusk. The life of a peasant is defined by the land you work, and the endless cycle of sowing, tending, and harvesting that ensures you eat, if you're lucky, for another season. If you're one of the fortunate few with an ox or a horse, they'll help plow the land. If not, it's just you and a crude wooden plow, cutting through the soil by hand. The work is grueling, and there's no time for rest. There are no weekends, no paid holidays. You work until your body can't go on any longer. But the physical toil doesn't end with farming. If you live in a town, you might work as a blacksmith, weaver, or carpenter, but your day is just as relentless. The forge crackles with heat as you hammer away at the glowing metal, while the weaver's loom clicks in rhythmic labor, creating cloth that will be sold for barely enough to feed a family. Every task is a reminder that survival doesn't come easy, and that every penny earned is hard-won. Even for artisans and traders, life is about one thing: survival. There are no days off, no luxuries, only the hard truth that if you don't work, you don't eat. It's not about ambition. It's about enduring. The pressure to work until you can't work anymore, to keep producing, keeps everyone moving. But there's no reward for doing well, just the satisfaction of knowing you might live to see the next sunrise. The strength of community bonds forged in hardship. Yet, for all the loneliness of the work, you're never truly alone. The medieval world is defined by community. While privacy is non-existent, solidarity is the backbone of daily life. Your survival depends not just on your own labor, but on the work of those around you. A neighbor's harvest failure could spell disaster for you. If their crop is ruined by pests or drought, you'll feel the sting. But if someone's ill, you'll be there with a bowl of soup. And if a neighbor's child falls sick, the whole village will pull together. In the village, there's a sense that everyone is in this together. The harvest festivals, the market days, and the church services are moments to rest, to connect, and to find some relief from the endless work. But these moments are fleeting, and it's always the struggle that binds everyone together. The constant demand to survive, to feed and clothe yourself and your family, creates a bond stronger than blood. The village's heart is the church, an institution that provides both spiritual guidance and a social safety net. Religion plays a central role, shaping every part of life. The church bells ring at sunrise, midday, and sunset, marking time and reminding everyone that faith is just as important as work. The church offers not just comfort, but rules too. It dictates behavior, sets moral standards, and reminds people that their actions in this life determine their fate in the next. Faith and fear, the role of religion in a medieval life. Religion in the Middle Ages was more than a spiritual belief. It was a social contract. The church held absolute power over the lives of people, dictating everything from marriage to diet. The fear of God's wrath was real and all-encompassing. Heaven and hell were not abstract concepts. They were as real as the ground beneath your feet. For many peasants, the church's teachings were a source of solace. The idea that suffering on earth would be rewarded in heaven was an essential part of medieval life. Hell was a terrifying reality, and the thought of eternal damnation haunted the minds of even the most devout. The church's moral guidance provided a path to salvation, but it also served as a reminder of human frailty. Every sin, every slip could lead you down the path to damnation, and for the medieval peasant, that threat was never far from their thoughts. Yet, the church wasn't just about fear. It also provided a framework for understanding life, a guide for how to live morally and honorably. And for many, that was enough to carry them through the darkest days. The rituals of the church, the prayers, the hymns, and the communal services offered moments of peace and connection in a world filled with so much uncertainty. The reality of disease and death, a constant threat. But peace was fleeting because in the Middle Ages, death was never far behind. The constant threat of disease, from the Black Death to more localized plagues, hung over every village. One day you could be working the fields, and the next you could be struck down by fever or plague. Disease didn't discriminate. It took young and old, rich and poor, with no rhyme or reason. In a world without antibiotics, without vaccines, the smallest cut could lead to infection, and illness could strike without warning. The Black Death alone claimed millions of lives across Europe, and for those who survived, life was never the same. The medieval world was shaped by a constant awareness that survival was never guaranteed. The threat of death loomed large, and each day was another step on the uncertain road of life. The impact of disease, famine, and war was devastating, and yet life went on. People still married, still raised children, still worked the land. But there was a pervasive sense of impermanence. It was not just the peasant's life that was fragile. Even the nobility, with all their riches and castles, were vulnerable. Death came for everyone in the end. Conclusion: a life of endurance and hope. Despite all the hardships, despite the backbreaking labor, the constant threat of death, and the ever-present struggle for survival, the medieval world was full of life. The people who lived in it weren't just surviving. They were living. They built families, they formed communities, they laughed and loved. In their struggles, they found moments of joy, of connection, and of shared humanity. In a world where so much was uncertain, the one constant was resilience. People didn't just endure, they thrived in their own way. They worked the land, raised their children, and came together to face the challenges of their world. The medieval world was one of constant hardship, but it was also one of incredible perseverance. And so, the legacy of the medieval world lives on, not just in the ruins of castles and churches, but in the stories of resilience and survival that continue to inspire us today. The people of the Middle Ages didn't know what the future held, but they faced it one day at a time, and in doing so, they made their mark on history.